Peter, that Graham Smith joke is not very ethical. But if nobody lays a complaint, we can't look at it. And that is exactly one of the things that we experience when, as Ombudsman, is that we get complaints, but nobody lays a complaint. So we'll have people phone in and they'll say, there's this issue and there's this member who's doing ABC, and will you please investigate and come to a conclusion? So Peter tells a joke about Graham Smith, and we didn't like that joke, we want you to investigate it. And we'll say, well, are you going to lay a complaint? Can we have some formal submission? And then they back off. And we find that that's one of the things that we're dealing with constantly with the role of Ombudsman. So if any of you would like to lay a complaint, you can see me afterwards, and we will investigate. All right. So I've just got to do I point this that way? That way. Okay. All right. What I'm going to try and go through in about probably 20 minutes or so are the following. The purpose of the Ombudsman, who we are, what we do, what we don't do, what we can do, what we should do, and questions. So I sort of try to sum up what my brief was from Graham. And I think they started with one, and the next one rolled, and the next one rolled. Then we had the strategy session yesterday, and there were some more questions. So that's what I'm going to cover very quickly. But what I'd really like is if we can have questions afterwards, because I find very often through the questions we learn a lot, and hopefully we can answer the questions and things that are on your mind. What are the purpose and... So I've just got to get used to this. The purpose and the powers of the Ombudsman, we really are there to investigate complaints. So to a large extent, it gives Unashamedly Ethical a system where there's some form of accountability. Without having any form of accountability, and we have already seen that, is the logo will be used for selfish purposes, to promote a business. Possibly there'll be the whole organization can very easily fall into disrepute as people just use the Unashamedly Ethical logo and the membership to promote their conduct for their businesses, where in fact there's absolutely no accountability for them. So what we try and do as Ombudsman is we're there really to look into that, and that's one of the roles that we play. So we make rulings on conduct. We have the power to suspend or expel people from Unashamedly Ethical. Something which I think is underutilized is that we can also be very much proactive in what we do. So, for example, I've made the note there of divorce. We have had many people who've approached us and asked us to mediate in divorce proceedings. And that is very much more a proactive role, as in there's no sanction. What we're really trying to do is help people through a very, very difficult time. I was mentioning to Graham, and I mentioned it yesterday as well, at the strategy session, that interestingly, people who are not members of Unashamedly Ethical have approached us, not in our capacity as Unashamedly Ethical, but Unashamedly Ethical has given us credibility in the marketplace that we would actually get involved in some form of mediation like this in a neutral way. So I'm an attorney, and I have clients who may be going through a divorce, and normally in that situation, as soon as I say, well, why don't you see a mediator, the immediate thing from the party on the other side, so I'll have my client, the party on the other side will go, well, I don't want to see that mediator because your attorneys appointed that or recommended that mediator. But if I say, why don't you see Keith Mateer, and he's the Ombudsman of Unashamedly Ethical, then it changes the whole scenario. So we've had a number of cases where they then see that Keith's acting as somebody who's independent, and I'm not referring Keith as a friend or a colleague. I'm referring him as somebody who is the Ombudsman of Unashamedly Ethical, and that he's an ethical advocate who's going to make a decision and try and mediate in that capacity. it has brought a lot of credibility to the proceedings, and we found that that has given him the credibility for people to use him. And strangely enough, it's been used more by people who are not members of Unashamedly Ethical than members of Unashamedly Ethical. And I think that that's something that certainly can be looked at going forward. Because I think, as I was saying again yesterday, that I think that family in this country is under tremendous attack. And one of the most contentious and most bitter things that one can go through is when families go through a divorce. And when you can have intervention with someone of Keith's capacity, you take a huge amount of the stress out of that sort of situation. So that's a proactive type of role that we have played and that we do play. Conflict resolution, assisting people with reputation, I'll get back to that in a minute. And the main factor is that we can do it in a way where we can come across as independent and where we are independent in our intervention. Okay, who are we? Well, firstly, you've got to be an ombudsman, you must have legal experience of 10 years or more. So you can conclude from that you've got to be reasonably old to be an ombudsman. Currently, there are two of us, Keith Mateer and myself. I'm an attorney, and Keith is senior counsel. Keith at the moment is acting as a judge in Johannesburg. And I searched for photographs of him, and the best I could get was that. Now, if any of you know Keith, this is Keith at his happiest. He spends, to put this in context, he's a senior counsel. He's got an LLB degree. He's got a Bachelor of Divinity degree. He's written a book called The Resurrection, A Lawyer's View. He's highly intellectual, very, very smart. But one of the things that he does is for about 5 weeks of the year, he gets on his horse with his good friend, and they ride into the rural areas of the Karoo and the Eastern Cape. And they go and they minister, basically, to the communities. So he just loves it. They sleep literally on the ground. When I told him that I was coming to talk today, he said, at the Lord Charles, he said, you should be having it in the Karoo somewhere. and that's his love. So, but he really does. He and his friend Sean get on their horses, and for 5 weeks, they ride into these communities. And they go and they meet, they go to farmers, introduce themselves to the farmers, and the farmers get together, their employees, and they get hold of their neighbors, and the neighbors get their employees together, and they minister to them and just interact with them. And this has been something they've started recently, and they're getting invited back to these communities and by farmers, etc. So it's quite a contrast, and he certainly, there's quite a big contrast between Keith and me, because my favorite form of transport is a car. But Keith is someone who is very, very deep. He's certainly, from a legal point of view, one of the deepest thinkers that I've come across and that I've dealt with a reputation of being a tenacious opponent in the legal field. But more recently, in the last few years, he's spent a lot of time judging, as he is now in Johannesburg, and where he again has a reputation of being incredibly efficient and somebody who really doesn't have a difficulty when it comes to seeing what's right and wrong. And I give you that context because I think it's important when you look at the proactive role that somebody like Keith can have in an organization like this. I think that there's a fantastic amount of good work that he can do, and I think he already has done, but that he can do in this organization. I think the other thing that is a problem, one of the things that is a problem of Keith is that he is a passionate, blind supporter of the Sharks. But one day we'll get over that. Yeah, exactly, yeah. It's his blind spot, as I say, his blind spot. All right. What we do, we consider referrals from members about members. They are business related. And this is very important. We often get people referring issues to us about people who are not members of Unashamedly Ethical, and we can't investigate. We have no authority over them, so that doesn't go very far. We mediate and we arbitrate. Those are the roles that we have predominantly played to date. So mediation, I'm sure you all know, but essentially that's where you try and facilitate some form of agreement between the parties, and you don't come up with a binding decision because it's mediation, not arbitration, but you can go a long way to bringing the parties together. So a very good example of that would be in a divorce situation where the judge eventually has to make the order, but what you can do is mediate the settlement and cut through all the issues and come up with the settlement, which then is made an order of a court. The other is arbitration. We've been used on a number of occasions to do this. The next slide, I think, will illustrate my point of why arbitration and mediation can be so useful. This is a picture of two farmers fighting over a cow, and the person doing the milking in the middle is the attorney. Now, that is a classic example of a situation, and you spend time in the legal field and you'll see that attorneys will do everything possible to make a matter proceed for as long as possible, because you can make as much as basically the longer it goes on, the more money you make. Now, one of the undertakings we make as Ombudsman is that if we're involved in a matter, once we have heard the evidence, we'll make a decision within 2 weeks. At the moment, if you go to the High Court, I'm sitting with a matter at the moment where we have waited for just about 2 years just to get the court date. That's just to get the court date. We now have to wait another 2 years to get to court. So that's 4 years to get to court. And in the meantime, you're just running through pleadings, you're running through evidence, and you're running up fees. If one were to use someone like Keith or myself in an arbitration, we'll give a decision within 2 weeks. Keith is particularly good at this, and there have been a number of occasions where he has done that. We've been involved in a number of matters where we've literally got through the whole matter in a month, from beginning to end. And these have been, the one particular matter that I think of was a High Court matter in the last, it was about 6 months ago. All the pleadings had been filed, and we got through the case in a month with a decision. And yeah, somebody loses, but I can tell you that in that particular situation, they probably saved R500,000 in costs easily. So that's a big advantage of and they were both members of Unashamedly Ethical, and they both got involved with the Ombudsman because of their knowing about this facility and the fact that they could use the Ombudsman. Interestingly, they hadn't thought of it at the start. Neither of them had thought of it. And it was just through a discussion somewhere, I think, Graham, with you. It might have been with you, that somebody had a discussion with you, and you said, why don't you use the Ombudsman? And it was sorted in a month. Not everybody's going to be happy, because in an arbitration there will be a loser. So, that is a reality. The other sort of work that we do is I suppose it's something which, again, you're going to have decisions going against the person who refers it. We've done quite a lot of work in the labor field, where we've had people who have been threatened with retrenchment or disciplinary action, and the conduct they believe has been unethical, and we've been able to give an opinion and hopefully help them in their role in resolving those issues. What we don't do is there've been a few cases of this where people have been involved in legally binding agreements, which they've requested that we look at to say, well, hang on, there are two people involved in an agreement. It's a legally binding agreement. The one person is feeling that that agreement is harsh, and that, if you look at it in a warm and fuzzy way, the person who's actually enforcing that agreement is now abusing the agreement, and they believe it's unethical. That becomes very difficult to try and change something like that. People have entered into the agreement. They've gone into it knowing what they're going into. The fact that it may end up costing somebody more than they anticipated doesn't necessarily mean that the other person has been unethical in the way they've dealt with the matter. And a binding agreement is a binding agreement. We're not easily going to look at that and overturn it, because I can tell you the minute we did that, the person who's had the contract overturned is going to turn around and say, but I have a binding agreement. Does this mean that agreements aren't worthwhile? And that's quite a hard thing, because agreements are harsh. You may be stuck in agreement with the escalation clause you never anticipated, and you never, maybe even both parties didn't anticipate it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an unethical agreement. It's a binding agreement. And there are those sort of things that we deal with on quite frequently. We deal with that. What we also can't do, the question of suspension, and this has been raised very recently. There was a very prominent matter of when can you suspend a member. We deal with a press which can be very mischievous. And the fact that there's an article in the newspaper which implicates somebody with certain conduct doesn't necessarily mean that they're guilty of that conduct. To the extent, in a case, one of the Sunday night TV programs ran an article or ran a program about somebody running a certain modeling agency, and you might all know about this, and it was linked to sexual abuse of the girls involved in this. And then they contacted Unashamedly Ethical, and they said, do you realize that this guy is a member of Unashamedly Ethical? That alone is not enough for us to suspend somebody. In that particular case, I got hold of the individual, and we were told emphatically that he was not guilty, and that this was basically just journalists looking for a story and creating a storm. So now you've got two sides to a story. You can't automatically go out and suspend somebody on the basis that they may be guilty of something. Can you wait for the criminal matter? You could wait 2 years, 3 years for a criminal matter for the outcome of a criminal matter. So the person would continue to be a member during that time. What you have to have is if you want to suspend somebody, you have to have an investigation. And there must be some evidence on which you're relying, other than hearsay evidence coming from journalists or from a newspaper report or a TV report. And if you think of it logically, in that case, people may think, well, the evidence seems to be overwhelming, but you haven't heard his side of the story. There are many cases where you'll find articles written about people in newspapers which allude to unethical conduct. That alone is not going to be enough. So that's something we've dealt with on a number of occasions, and there's been accusations made against us for not taking action to suspend somebody in those circumstances. But until somebody lodges a complaint, a formal complaint, and there's some evidence that we hear and that we can act on, we actually can't suspend, or for that matter, expel. So, yes, I think I used again yesterday the example of Noseweek. Noseweek is something which publishes articles almost on a monthly basis. There are a lot of people there that believe that those articles are always accurate. Sometimes they're not, and it's a particular publication which I think provokes, and you can't rely on that to reach a decision to suspend anyone. What are the things that we could be doing? As I've mentioned, I think some of the things that we could be doing a lot more effectively or be used a lot more for would be mediation and arbitration. One of the things, Keith was involved in a matter, and which I would again just put out there, is where there are allegations made against you, be it through the press, for example. It may be, let's just use something such as there's been a lot of publicity recently on tendering. There's been the CTICC. There's been a huge amount of news on tendering linked to the development of the CTICC, etc. Where, if you're a member of Unashamedly Ethical and you happen to be on the receiving side of a false allegation, one of the things that you can do is to use the Ombudsman to investigate and come up with a report if you feel you want your name cleared. the advantage of using the Ombudsman is that you're going to get a neutral report. Keith and I deliberately are not members of Unashamedly Ethical, because to be members, we immediately would be compromised in a whole number of ways. So it's not that you're using a member of the same organization that you're a member of, but the reality is that you're going to get an independent report which you can then use to clear your name. And that has been used once before, and I think that is something that one could think of where there are allegations against you or your company, and it's one way of being able to immediately deal with it, because often these things drag on for years, and in that time your reputation is tarnished. So that's something that one could do, which I think can be very effective. And then, yeah, as I say, I've dealt with the issues of mediation and arbitration and the advantages that using the Ombudsman can bring. That's something else to consider. The other thing where I think that the Ombudsman could be used is, for example, to clear one's name with government. That was something that if one looks at the original Constitution, it's included in the Constitution, the Unashamedly Ethical Constitution, is that, let's say, for example, one has a track record of tax evasion and you've joined the Unashamedly Ethical now and you really want to try and deal with this. One of the ways of being able to do that is to approach Keith or myself and let us take that on and go to the relevant authorities to see what we can how we can resolve that for you. And again, you're not using an attorney or an advocate in the normal sense, but you're using an organization which is coming with a certain background, a certain amount of credibility, and with certain contacts in government which can be used to try and further this aim. So that's something else that one can think of. The one question that was raised yesterday is, and I actually haven't had a chance to discuss it further with Graham, is what happens if you have a track record of, let us say, for example, tax evasion, and you then sign up with Unashamedly Ethical, and it then is exposed that prior to signing up you had this track record. How does one deal with that? And I think there's a reality, and that is that probably certainly all business people at some stage or another have been involved in some things which they're probably not that proud of. And so if you're going to say you can't sign up and you can't be a member of Unashamedly Ethical because of previous conduct, you're probably going to exclude most businesses. What my suggestion would be is that in signing up, you disclose issues of the past that you would like addressed, or that you want to just say, right, this is confession of what has gone in the past, but from now on, this is how we're clearing our name, and we're now part of Unashamedly Ethical. And that's something that I think that as a committee we can look at, and the Unashamedly Ethical Committee can look at, because there's always going to be a problem, and I think up to now we've dealt with it on a substance over form basis, looking at the issues that have arisen. It hasn't really been a problem, but it may be something that's preventing people from joining. And I think that could be something that could be looked at, just to allow people who have baggage to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to put that behind me and I want to move forward. And that's it. Are there any questions? The fee structure at the moment is that Unashamedly Ethical pays for the Ombudsman. And then if there is a lot of work involved, so for normal intervention, Unashamedly Ethical covers the initial costs of a matter. If it's something that's going to involve, for example, let's say, for example, a divorce, and there's a requirement of ongoing mediation, because that can be quite lengthy, then an agreement is reached with the parties, and it's on a case-by-case basis. But the initial introductions, meetings, assessments, that is all part of the arrangement that we have with Unashamedly Ethical.
That's no reflection on us as politicians.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Graham, just a question. If churches are members of Unashamedly Ethical, when they have contentious issues, would they have access to the Ombudsman? Because I know right now they are just as businesses having issues, churches are also having issues. And it's over land and it's over buildings and all kinds of things. One particular case ran for quite a few years. I think it was that guy was sitting in the middle of the cow there. It was taking all the money. But do the churches, if they are members, do they have access to the Ombudsman to get this thing speedily sorted out?
Yes.
Yeah, as long as both parties are members, I would assume.
Yes, both parties. And I suspect even if they were not, if the one party was a member, I'm sure that given the nature of that sort of dispute, they would have access, yes. And on that, one of Keith and I worked together in the Eastern Cape for many years, and then also when we both moved to Cape Town at different times, we ended up working down here. And we did the Methodist Church work for 15 years or so. And one of the things that Keith was instrumental in introducing there was a dispute resolution procedure in the Methodist Church. And part of that was to stop members taking the church to court all the time. Because I can still remember sitting in court, and it was another church, it wasn't the Methodist Church, but the judge, your court is full, and you've got a judge sitting there, and the judge looked at these parties and said, you guys are Christians. Here you are at loggerheads with teams of advocates and attorneys, and you've got a public gallery which is full, and it just brings the name of the church into disrepute, and it's just a terrible indictment of Christians. So we introduced that dispute resolution into the Methodist Church, where even today, if you in the church and you want to challenge some issue, you have to follow a procedure which keeps it out of court. And I think that's, it's a very good procedure. And that's really what this is as well. It's a dispute resolution procedure.
Maybe just while we see if there are any other questions, just to say that Keith and Graham, when he says that it's covered by Unashamedly Ethical, they actually offer up their time. And there is no charge that they have, but they do that initial investigation and mediation as part of their tithe, part of their giving. And I want to say to you and to Graham a huge thank you. That small amount that we do probably doesn't even cover your cell phone costs per month. So we really are thankful for that. Any other questions, friends? I think the key issue is that the Ombudsman have not really necessarily been understood by our thousands of members out there. Those that have used it, all would use them again tomorrow because it's just been such a tremendous saving of time and cost. But I think one of the reasons for asking Keith to be here today is so that we, as members, and I think hopefully most of you are members, if not you will be before you leave today, is that we just be aware of what they can and what they can't do. Any other questions? Going, gone.